Rain hit the jungle canopy like falling bullets, each drop sharp and cold against the metal wreckage of the downed human pod. Commander Ely Ward coughed as he dragged himself out of the cracked escape hatch, blood running down his arm, the fire behind him spitting sparks into the damp air like angry spirits. The ship was gone, the crew scattered or dead. And this wasn't just any planet, it was Forbidden's. His boots sank into the thick blue moss, and the ground trembled faintly beneath his steps as if the jungle itself was alive and watching him. He gritted his teeth, tying a strip of fabric over the gash in his side, but it didn't stop the slow, pulsing pain that made his fingers numb. He had no signal, no food, no weapon, and only the sound of distant alien screeches to remind him that he was not alone. They had told him about this planet back at the Terran borders, in whispers and warnings. Stay clear of Zalara 7. No one had returned from it, not a single explorer, not a single drone. And now he was stranded on its surface with a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. His gums crackled, dead and silent, and the jungle pressed in with glowing vines and strange flower-like eyes that blinked without lids. Ely stumbled into a hollow space where ancient ruins had fused with the roots of glowing trees. It looked like a forgotten temple. Smooth stone walls and arches covered in strange runes that shimmered faintly under the night sky. He sank to his knees against one of the walls, the pain finally catching up to him. Vision blurring from blood loss and exhaustion. Then came the sound of breathing, not his own. Light footsteps moved just beyond the edge of the structure, slow and careful, as if someone or something was watching him from the dark. He reached for a broken piece of metal to defend himself, but his hand fell limp as the world tilted sideways. From the shadows she stepped forward, not quite human, not quite beast. Her skin glowed like pale lavender under the moonlight, and her large eyes locked onto his wound, wide and unblinking. She was beautiful in a haunting way, with dark markings curling across her cheeks like tribal lines, and long hair braided with crystals and feathers. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a whisper. She knelt beside him without fear, her fingers brushing against the blood-stained fabric at his side as her head tilted, studying the damage with strange curiosity. Then, without warning, she lowered her head and began to lick the wound. Ely flinched, shocked, but her tongue was warm, and where it touched him, the pain began to fade. His muscles twitched from the shock, but he couldn't move away, not just because of the pain, but because something about her touch made him stay. She looked up into his eyes again, and this time he saw more than curiosity. He saw recognition. The blood was gone, but the mark on his skin glowed faintly where she had licked it, as if her saliva carried something unnatural or sacred. She placed a hand over his chest, pressed firmly, and whispered something he didn't understand, a chant or a vow in her strange tongue. The jungle hushed, like it had witnessed a ritual, and Ely realized she had just claimed him in a way that felt ancient and irreversible. He tried to speak again, but his voice cracked with confusion. She simply stood, silent and calm, and beckoned him with her glowing hand deeper into the jungle. And despite the pain, despite the fear, Ely followed her, not because he wanted to, but because something deep inside told him he now belonged to her. Ely didn't know how long they walked, but the pain was gone, and the jungle didn't feel so deadly anymore. The strange girl moved ahead of him like she belonged to the forest, never tripping, never hesitating, always looking back to make sure he was still following. He wanted to ask her questions, who she was, what she had done to him, but every time he opened his mouth, her glowing eyes made him silent. They reached a clearing with a pool of water that shimmered like silver under the dark sky. Blue mist drifted across the surface, and bioluminescent petals floated around the edges like they were alive. She motioned for him to sit near the water while she knelt beside it, dipping her hands in and pulling out a bowl carved from bone and crystal. He watched closely as she mixed the water with a powder from a pouch at her side, chanting under her breath as if calling something ancient. The liquid glowed, and she brought it to him, holding the bowl with both hands like it was sacred. Eli hesitated, unsure, but her expression was so calm, so steady, that he took it and drank. It was cold and sweet, but then it burned his throat like fire, and his chest seized with sudden pressure. He gasped and dropped the bowl, falling to one knee as his vision turned bright and his skin tingled. The pain returned for one short moment, then vanished, replaced by a deep warmth that spread through his body like light under his skin. She came close again, touching the center of his chest with 2 fingers and watching the faint, glowing lines that began to form on his skin. They looked like vines or roots, curling from the wound she had licked and spreading outward across his chest like living tattoos. Eli stared at her, confused and shaking, but she only whispered one word in her strange language, a name that sounded like Tharia. He pointed to her and repeated it, and she smiled for the first time since they met. Then she pointed to him and waited, as if asking for his name in return. "Eli," he said, and she nodded, as if she had known all along. Suddenly, the jungle roared behind them, deep howls and rustling leaves, something massive moving just out of sight. Tharia jumped to her feet and stood between Eli and the trees, her hands raised, her eyes glowing brighter now like stars trapped in her skull. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything stood still, even the wind. Then from the forest, 3 creatures stepped out. They looked like beasts made of stone and vine, tall as humans, with tusks and glowing red eyes, their bodies pulsing with green energy. Eli reached for a weapon he didn't have, but Tharia raised one hand to stop him. She spoke in a commanding voice, her tone sharp and proud, and the beasts paused, tilting their heads toward her like obedient guards. Then she pointed to Eli, and the lead creature stepped forward, sniffing him, then bowing its head slowly in submission. Eli didn't breathe. He couldn't, because something inside him now understood what just happened. He hadn't just been healed by an alien girl. He had been marked, chosen, and claimed in front of the jungle's own guardians. The creatures backed away, fading into the dark trees again without a sound, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Tharia turned to him and touched his shoulder gently, then spoke softly in her language, her voice warmer now. Eli didn't understand the words, but the meaning felt clear in her eyes. He was no longer a stranger in this jungle. He was something more, something tied to her, and this place by a bond that could not be broken. And as he looked down at the glowing vines on his skin, he knew something had changed inside him forever. The night grew thicker as they moved deeper into the jungle, but Eli could feel something different now. The fear that had gripped him when he first crashed was gone, replaced by a strange calm that came from the glowing marks on his chest. He touched the lines again, tracing their warmth with his fingers, and the vines on his skin pulsed lightly under his touch. Tharia walked beside him now, not ahead like before, and every time their arms brushed, he felt a faint charge between them. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words carried weight, like echoes of an ancient language meant for more than just sound. Eli watched her carefully, the way she moved, the way her eyes scanned the shadows, and he began to wonder if she was more than just a survivor of this world. Suddenly, the ground shook with a deep rumble, and the trees around them twisted unnaturally, as if responding to some distant force. Tharia froze, her expression tight, and without warning, she grabbed Eli's wrist and pulled him into a narrow tunnel covered in thick roots. Inside, it was dark and wet, the air thick with moss and old stone. But she didn't stop moving until they reached a chamber lined with carvings. The walls told stories of humans and aliens locked in conflict, of strange unions and shared blood, of wounds that became bonds. Eli's eyes widened as he recognized one of the figures. It looked like a human with markings just like his, standing beside a glowing female shape. Tharia lit a crystal with a touch, casting golden light across the stone, and pointed to a part of the wall where 2 beings stood joined by a beam of light from their hearts. "What is this?" Eli whispered, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. But Tharia stepped closer and placed her hand over his wound. Then over her own chest where faint markings shimmered beneath her clothing. She looked into his eyes, and the silence that followed was louder than thunder. He understood then. It wasn't just healing she had done. By licking his wound, by touching his skin, by giving him the glowing drink, she had performed something sacred, something binding. It wasn't just instinct, it was tradition, maybe even law. And now he was part of something he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. The chamber trembled again, and Tharia looked up sharply before moving to a small alcove and pulling out a blade made of crystal and bone. She handed it to him, her fingers wrapping his tightly around the hilt, as if telling him there was no more time to be uncertain. Outside, the jungle howled like a living storm, and Eli gripped the blade even though he didn't know how to use it. Tharia said one word, firm and clear, "Vashtan." And then she ran out into the dark with Eli close behind. They emerged into another clearing where a black shape loomed like a shadow made of smoke and metal, its eyes glowing white with fury. Eli stopped dead, heart pounding, as the creature turned toward them and screamed, a sound that made the trees bend away. Tharia raised her hands, speaking in her tongue, but the beast didn't listen. It charged, and the ground cracked beneath its weight, roots shattering and stone breaking under its claws. Eli didn't think he moved, diving to the side and slashed with the blade blindly as it passed. The weapon hummed with energy, and where it touched the creature's flesh, light burst out like fire. The beast stumbled, roaring in rage, but it wasn't dead. It turned, faster this time, and headed for Tharia. Eli yelled and ran forward, blade raised again, and this time he aimed true. The crystal edge sank into the creature's chest, and it let out one final scream before it collapsed into dust and vanished into the wind. Silence returned, and Tharia stood still, breathing hard, her eyes on Eli, not with fear, but with something deeper. She walked to him slowly and touched the spot where the blade had marked the beast's flesh. Then she touched Eli's chest again, over the glowing vines, and smiled with pride. He didn't feel like a lost pilot anymore, not with her, not on this planet, not with the bond they now shared. Something had awakened between them, and it was stronger than fear, stronger than language, and stronger than anything he had known before. Eli sat by the glowing pool, watching ripples move across the surface without wind. The night had calmed, but something inside him hadn't. Something was growing stronger each hour, since Tharia had licked his wound. He touched the vine-like marks on his skin again, and they pulsed like veins alive with alien fire. Tharia crouched across from him, silent, sharpening a small blade with slow, careful strokes. She glanced at him from time to time, but there was something different in her eyes now, not curiosity, but worry. He wanted to ask what was coming, but he didn't have her words, only her expressions, and those were harder to read tonight. Far in the distance, flashes of purple light lit the sky, followed by thunder that cracked without clouds. Eli stood slowly, his muscles still stiff, but his strength returning faster than it should have, like his body was no longer entirely his own. He looked to Tharia, and she nodded, standing as well and motioning toward the west where the lights were strongest. As they walked, the trees around them became twisted and burned, the glowing plants dimming like they were afraid. Eli saw strange symbols, burned into the bark, symbols that matched the marks on his chest but distorted and broken. The jungle didn't sing here, no chirps, no rustling, no signs of life, only silence and ash. A great stone gate appeared ahead, carved with the faces of creatures Eli couldn't name, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. Tharia touched the side of the gate and whispered something, and the stone groaned before sliding open with ancient weight. Inside, the air was colder, and a blue flame flickered on its own from torches mounted in the walls. They stepped into a long corridor lined with bones, some human, Some knot and Eli felt a chill creep down his spine. Tharia pressed forward without fear, but her shoulders were tense now, her steps quicker, and her eyes sharp. At the end of the tunnel, a large chamber opened, and at its center stood a platform glowing like a heartbeat. On that platform lay something wrapped in black cloth and held down by glowing metal bands. Tharia approached slowly and knelt beside it, pressing her palm to the ground in what looked like a prayer. Eli watched in silence, unsure if he should kneel too, or just wait and listen. Then the cloth moved. A hand broke free, twisted. Broken version of what looked like a female alien, her skin cracked and eyes white as bone. She opened her mouth, and a growl came out that shook the chamber. Tharia leapt back, shouting in her language, but Eli didn't need words to understand. This creature wasn't dead. It was imprisoned, and it was the reason the jungle had gone silent, the reason the trees twisted, the reason Tharia looked afraid. The creature lunged against the glowing restraints, and sparks flew where the bindings held it down. Eli stepped forward without thinking, raising the crystal blade. But Tharia grabbed his arm and shook her head. She pointed at his chest. The vines were glowing brighter now, faster, like they were reacting to the creature's presence. He touched the markings, and the chamber lights flared, forcing the creature back with a scream of pain. Whatever had been done to him, it was more than healing. He was now a key, or a weapon, or maybe both. Tharia placed her hand over his heart and nodded, then pointed again at the creature, then to the chamber walls lined with symbols. She was showing him the truth, that this was not just a tomb, but a prison built long ago by others like her, and maybe others like him. The creature screeched again, and this time one of the glowing bands cracked. Tharia pulled Eli back toward the exit, her voice urgent and fast now, panic in every step. He didn't resist, he followed, his mind spinning with what he'd just seen. Once outside, the wind had returned, and the jungle pulsed again with light. Tharia grabbed a sharp piece of stone and carved a fresh symbol into Eli's arm, not deep enough to bleed, but enough to sting. The mark glowed white, and she whispered the word again, Vashtan. This time with fear in her voice. Eli looked back toward the sealed gate as the earth shook under his feet. He didn't need anyone to tell him. Whatever was locked behind that door wasn't going to stay locked for long. And somehow, it was connected to the bond between him and Tharia, a bond he barely understood but now had no choice but to accept. The earth didn't stop shaking for hours after they left the prison chamber. Trees split down the middle, stones cracked under their feet, and strange creatures rushed through the jungle like they were fleeing something they couldn't fight. Eli and Tharia ran, moving fast through the twisted vines and glowing roots, her hand gripping his wrist like she would never let go. Every step brought more questions, but no time for answers. The symbol she carved into his arm still glowed, pulsing with each beat of his heart, and it burned hotter the closer they got to the jungle's heart. Tharia finally stopped when they reached a rise where a broken temple stood beneath the moon's glow. Its spires collapsed, but its center still intact. She pulled him inside quickly, and closed a stone door behind them with a groaning sound that echoed like thunder. Eli dropped to one knee, chest heaving, the blade in his hand buzzing faintly with stored energy. Tharia moved to a circle of light etched into the floor, placing her hands on it, and the room lit up with symbols along the walls. She turned to him and began drawing in the dust simple shapes, stick figures, circles, a story told in the language of symbols. She showed a figure like Eli marked with the same glowing vines, then another figure like her standing beside him, then a third figure, broken and blackened, rising from beneath the earth with fire pouring from its mouth. Eli watched carefully, his eyes narrowing as she repeated the final part, him and her, standing before the shadow, the light from their chests pushing it back. He pointed to himself, then to her, and then to the drawing, and she nodded with a hard stare. Whatever was breaking free from that chamber was older than both of them, and it wasn't coming for peace. Tharia stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest. then her own, then brought their foreheads together. Her breath soft against his skin. Eli froze, not from fear, but from something deeper, a bond, a promise, a calling he hadn't asked for but now couldn't run from. The temple pulsed with light, and a second mark appeared on his other arm, different from the first, but equally bright. He gasped as heat rushed through him, and this time, he didn't fall, he stood stronger, more awake, more alive than ever before. Tharia backed away, picking up another blade and strapping it across her back, her face hardened. With resolve, they were preparing for something neither of them fully understood. But time was gone, and fate had already moved its pieces. Outside, a screech split the night sky, followed by a storm of wind that knocked leaves and branches from the trees. Eli ran to the temple entrance and looked out. Firelight lit the sky above the jungle's center, and something large was moving between the trees. It wasn't just the beast from before. It was something greater, like the jungle itself had awakened with a spirit of war. Tharia came to his side and handed him a second blade, shorter but heavier, shaped like a fang. He nodded without words and followed her out into the wild once more. This time not with fear, but with purpose. The vines under his feet opened for him, glowing paths lighting the way forward, guiding him like a chosen part of the forest. They moved fast toward the burning center, where ash rained from above and creatures of every shape ran in terror. A shadow rose from the ground in the distance, a massive figure, all bone and black light, with twisted wings and a mouth like a cave. Eli's breath caught in his throat, and Tharia stepped in front of him, not to shield him but to stand beside him. He remembered the first time she touched his wound, how strange and wild it had felt. Now it felt like destiny, as if that moment had started a chain of events meant to lead them both here, to this final battle. The earth shook harder, and the wind screamed louder as the shadow turned its head and locked eyes on them from across the burning trees. Eli stepped forward, both blades ready, and the markings on his arms lit up like fire beneath his skin. Tharia stood beside him, her own skin glowing with the ancient energy of her people, the bond between them pulsing in the air like thunder, and the monster roared as it charged toward them, the ground splitting open beneath its steps as the final night began. The ground split open beneath their feet as the monstrous shadow surged forward, its body a swirling storm of bone, flame, and screaming wind. It towered above the trees, its wings stretching wide like broken sails, its claws scraping fire from the earth with every step. Eli gripped both blades, his breath steady, his arms glowing brighter with each heartbeat, as if his blood had turned into light. Tharia stood beside him, her hands raised high, chanting in her tongue as a circle of glowing roots twisted around her feet. The jungle answered her call. Vines snapped from the ground, flowers lit up in brilliant colors, and the air shimmered with unseen power. But the beast roared again, and the sound cracked trees in half, sending waves of black smoke across the battlefield. Eli charged forward first, the crystal blade in his right hand slicing through the smoke like it was cloth. He leapt, twisting midair, and drove the blade deep into the creature's leg. But it wasn't flesh, it was something ancient and cursed. Resistant to pain, the monster swiped at him, knocking him across the jungle floor and slamming him into a rock with a force that shook the mountain. Tharia screamed and launched herself into the air, landing on the beast's back and stabbing down with both hands. The creature twisted violently, trying to shake her off, but she held tight, vines shooting from her wrists and wrapping around its horns. Her markings glowed like suns now, every inch of her body alive with the jungle's power. Eli coughed blood, his vision blurry, but the markings on his skin flared white-hot, lifting him to his feet like something inside him refused to die. He looked down at his hands. The blades were gone, broken, but the light inside him wasn't fading. He ran forward again, barehanded, and as the monster reared its head, he slammed both glowing palms into its chest. The explosion wasn't fire, it was silence. A shockwave of pure light erupted from Eli's hands, freezing the monster mid-roar as its body cracked like glass. Tharia jumped clear, just before the light shattered the creature from within, breaking its core and turning it into falling dust that scattered across the trees. Silence returned, thicker than before, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Eli fell to his knees, drained, his skin still glowing faintly but now fading. Slowly back to its natural shade, Tharia limped toward him, her body bruised and bloodied, but her smile gentle, proud, and full of something ancient and tender. She knelt beside him and placed one hand on his chest, over the marks, over his heart, and said his name softly. "Eli," she whispered, and then spoke another word, one he didn't recognize, but he felt it in his bones. It meant bonded, not by accident, not by blood, but by choice. The jungle pulsed once more, but this time it was peaceful. The vines closed the broken ground, the trees straightened, and the stars above burned brighter than ever before. Whatever curse had awakened here, it was gone now, and the bond that saved this place could never be broken. Eli stood slowly, leaning on Tharia as they walked toward the temple ruins, the sky clearing above them like a promise. He didn't know if he would ever return to Earth, or if his people would ever find him again, but he no longer felt lost. He had come here wounded, afraid and alone, and now he was whole, fearless, and bound to a world and a soul unlike his own. As they reached the edge of the glowing pool where it all began, Tharia dipped her hand into the water and let it drip over his arms. The glowing marks faded, but not the connection, not the bond, not the memory, not the meaning behind her first touch. Because the moment she licked his wound, she hadn't just healed him, she had chosen him, and in the end, he had chosen her too.